We move on now to the 12th presentation here at the Californian Camp 1983. And this is the 7:30 presentation on Tuesday nights. As we move on now into the continued study of Jacob's trouble. Now, one thing which impresses my mind very much as I consider the parallel between Jacob's experience and the experience with God's folk at the end of time is this. The better we learn the lessons of faith and submissive obedience today, the less of a struggle, the less of an agony we're going to go through when that time finally comes. And therefore, we need to welcome every opportunity that God gives to us to test our faith and our obedience. Instead of complaining as we are prone to do, not that I've heard you complaining particularly, but I'm talking about human nature in general, instead of becoming distressed when perplexities come, let's thank the Lord that we're passing through a night of trial, because this gives us the opportunity to practice and prepare for that which is coming. And there's nothing more serious for us to have in a time of ease and freedom from trouble and difficulty at the present time, because we just simply don't get the practice we need to develop the faith that will pass through that trying period. I turn back in the book Patriarchs and Prophets to page 197 and come now to the most crucial part of Jacob's experience, the battle with the angel on that very, very terrible night. Now, first of all, note the words, it was midnight. And what is midnight? It's the darkest hour. And as you remember, of course, that is the time when the wise virgins go forth to meet the bridegroom. I'll turn to Christ Object Lessons, page 415, or 414, I should more correctly say, page 414, Christ Object Lessons. The coming of the bridegroom was at midnight, the darkest hour. So the coming of Christ will take place in the darkest period of this earth's history. The days of Noah and Lot picture the condition of the world just before the coming of the Son of Man. The Scriptures, pointing forward to this time, declare that Satan will work with all power and with all deceivableness and unrighteousness. His working is plainly revealed by the rapidly increasing darkness, the multitudinous errors, heresies and delusions of these last days. Not only is Satan leading the world captive, but his deceptions are leavening the professed churches of our Lord Jesus Christ. The great apostasy will develop into darkness deep as midnight, impenetrable as sackcloth of hair. To God's people, it'll be a night of trial, a night of weeping, a night of persecution for the truth's sake. But out of that night of darkness, God's light will shine. Now, without going ahead for the moment in the story of Jacob's trouble, the trouble that Jacob himself went through, the struggle began at midnight, but when did it end? What did the angel say? Let me go for the day breaketh. And so the statement says, but out of that night of darkness, God's light will shine. Let me now read further from page 197 of Patriarchs and Prophets. It was midnight. All that made life dear to him were at a distance, exposed to danger and death. Bitterest of all was the thought that it was his own sin which had brought this peril upon the innocent. With earnest cries and tears he made his prayer before God. Suddenly a strong hand was laid upon him. He thought that an enemy was seeking his life, and he endeavoured to wrest himself from the grasp of his assailants. He thought what? An enemy was trying to take his life, or was seeking his life. Was he mistaken? He was. In the darkness, the two struggled for the mastery. Not a word was spoken, but Jacob put forth all his strength and did not relax his efforts for a moment. While he was thus battling for his life, the sense of his guilt pressed upon his soul. His sins rose up before him to shut him out from God. But, now note this next sentence, this to me is a very, very vital one, but in his terrible extremity he remembered God's promises and his whole heart went out in entreaty for his mercy. So in that desperately dark hour, what did Jacob remember? The promises of God. Now, what a fatal predicament he would have been in if previous to this point of time he had not learned the promises of God, if he had not known them and the power which was in them, then what a predicament he'd been at this point of time. In fact, as you read this statement, it says, while he was thus battling for his life, the sense of his guilt pressed upon his soul. His sins rose up before him to shut him out from God. And when you read that far, the obvious impression is that these factors were about to separate him completely from God and ruin him or destroy him. The next sentence begins with the words, but, which of course tells us that what might have happened didn't happen. He was not separated from God because in his terrible extremity he remembered God's promises and his whole heart went out in entreaty for his mercy. The struggle continued until near the break of day, when the stranger placed his finger upon Jacob's thigh and he was crippled instantly. The patriarch now discerned the character of his antagonist. Let's pause there a moment and recognize the fact, which is extremely important in the parallel between this and the last days, that Jacob was fighting against God himself, but he did not know it. Jacob fought against God, but he did not know it. This means then that during the time of Jacob's trouble, we in a certain sense are actually going to be at war with God, and we won't know it. Otherwise the parallel is incomplete, or erroneous, I should better say. And this is the point I want to develop in our study of Jacob's trouble, the way in which God's folk will fight against him, actually fight against him during Jacob's trouble, during this hour of terrible darkness, until they finally understand what they're doing. Now, the moment that Jacob came to be aware that he was in conflict with a heavenly messenger, what did he stop doing? He stopped fighting, right? He stopped fighting. Let me now read on page 197. He knew that he'd been in conflict with a heavenly messenger, and this is why his almost superhuman effort had not gained the victory. It was Christ, the angel of the covenant, who had revealed himself to Jacob. The patriarch was now disabled and suffering the keenest pain, but he would not loosen his hold. All penitent and broken, he clung to the angel. He wept and made supplication, pleading for a blessing. He must have the assurance that his sin was pardoned. Physical pain was not sufficient to divert his mind from this object. His determination grew stronger, his faith more earnest and persevering until the very last. The angel tried to release himself. He urged, "Let me go, for the day breaketh." But Jacob answered, "I will not let thee go, except thou bless me." And the next paragraph plainly says, Jacob had power over the angel and prevailed, Hosea 12 verse 4. Through humiliation, repentance and self-surrender, the sinful, erring mortal prevailed with the majesty of heaven. He had fastened his trembling grasp upon the promises of God, and the heart of infinite love could not turn away the sinner's plea. I just hope I can convey to you what I can see in this paragraph, these several paragraphs tonight, because the message contained therein is extremely vital for our present development toward the battle soon to be fought against the powers of darkness. Now, the next paragraph says, the error which had led to Jacob's sin in obtaining the birthright by fraud was now clearly set before him. He had not trusted God's promises, but sought by his own efforts to bring about that which God would have accomplished in his own time and way. Now, what does this mean? It means that up until this point of time, Jacob had not truly understood the Sabbath rest principles. But at this point of time, the divine Spirit opened his eyes to discern the real nature, the real evil of his attempt to build God's kingdom by his own devisings. So the fullness of God's character and the perfection of the Sabbath rest principle became apparent to Jacob only at this point of time. And we'll find in the study of the second and last Jacob's trouble, when we are the Jacobs and the enemy are the Esau's, that even we shall not fully understand and see the Sabbath rest principles until the end of the struggle called Jacob's trouble. Now, it may sound strange to say at this moment when we've already written a book on the subject, when we've spent so much time talking about the Sabbath rest principle, we say, well, now how can it be? It's going to take all that to finally get out of our systems this deeply embedded error, the papal principle of man building God's kingdom man's way. Let's now look at the coming time of Jacob's trouble to discern what these things mean and the parallel between what Jacob went through and what we shall experience in the last days. Now there's presently developing a build-up toward the final climactic struggle of the ages. And we'll need to spend a few moments progressing through or studying through this progressive development of trouble in the world. It'll bring about this final effort upon man's part to establish God's kingdom their own way. I turn to the book Great Controversy again, this time to the chapter entitled The Impending Conflict, starting on page 593, I believe. It doesn't, page 583 rather. 583. The Impending Conflict. This is a very valuable chapter because it spells out the step-by-step development between the present time which we live and what is coming in the near future. I'll turn first of all to, I think, page 586, page 587. This is that point where it talks about the setting aside of the fourth commandment in order to get rid of the seventh-day Sabbath and the law of God altogether. Let's go back briefly to the time before 1844 when the Protestant churches were very powerful in their presentation of the law of God. They were great preachers of the law and called upon their congregations to obey the law of God to the very letter, albeit, of course, they kept Sunday in the place of the seventh-day Sabbath, the first day in the place of the seventh day. Before the first angel's message came, however, they had sunken into a state of very, very serious apostasy, as is presented to us in the story of the Sardis church in Revelation chapter 3 and the first several verses. And when the everlasting gospel was preached to them in the power of the Spirit, what did they do with that message of the gospel? They rejected it. And when they turned their backs upon the first angel's message, what did they do? What only could they do with the second angel's message? Reject it in turn. And if you want to follow this through, of course, read the chapter in early writings called A Firm Platform, starting over about page 260 or thereabouts. And there Sister Wright outlines the progressive development of rejection on the part of those churches and shows that those who turned their backs upon the first angel's message could not receive the second angel's message. That was impossible. And in like manner, those who rejected the first and second angel's messages could see no light in the third angel's message. And therefore, for them to accept the seventh-day Sabbath was an impossibility. They couldn't do it. Only those who accepted the gospel and followed through the light that came from that gospel could come through and receive the seventh-day Sabbath. Of course, eventually, that very class of people were to lose the spirituality of the Sabbath, yet they still retained the form. Now, this meant then that the Protestant churches were in a predicament because, on the one hand, they claimed to believe in the Bible and the Bible only as their one and only rule of faith. They claimed to believe in the Ten Commandments, and the Adventist folks simply said to them, now look, you folk claim these things, but why don't you keep the fourth commandment which says the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God, remember to keep it holy. Well, they now needed some way of justifying their belief in the Bible on the one side and their rejection of the seventh-day Sabbath upon the other side. And their tactic was to do away with the law and the Sabbath together. As you now read on page 587 of the book Great Controversy. And as the claims of the fourth commandment are urged upon the people, it is found that the observance of the seventh-day Sabbath is enjoined and is the only way to free themselves from a duty which they are unwilling to perform. Many popular teachers declare that the law of God is no longer binding. Thus they cast away the law and the Sabbath together. As the work of Sabbath reform extends, this rejection of the divine law to avoid the claims of the fourth commandment will become well nigh universal. Now, men cannot do that kind of thing except they're sowing for a future reaping. You can't lay aside God's holy law. You can't teach the world that the Sabbath is no longer binding and the law of God is a thing for the Jews and the Jews only, without opening the floodgates of iniquity and strife and trouble upon the world. You just can't do it. Just as surely as you can't go out into a field and sow thorn seeds and not get a harvest of thorns. You just can't do it. If you do the one, the other one follows in due turn, or in due time. And so it says in the rest of the paragraph, the teachings of religious leaders. Now, what are the teachings of religious leaders? That the Sabbath and the law are no longer binding. These teachings have opened the door to infidelity, to spiritualism, and to contempt for God's holy law, and upon these leaders rests a fearful responsibility for the iniquity that exists in the Christian world. Now, this is a very interesting statement because these teachers, these religious teachers referred to here, of course, today, are to all appearances models of sanctity, aren't they? Men who verbally deplore the wickedness in the land and give every impression that they are mighty influences to stay the tide of evil, when in fact they are the cause of this tide of evil. And they don't know it, apparently, and of course the people are deceived by their very pretentious and wonderful statements and claims. As Sister Wright now says, yet this very class put forth the claim that the fast-spreading corruption is largely attributable to the desecration of the so-called Sunday Sabbath, and that the enforcement of Sunday observance would greatly improve the morals of society. This claim is especially urged in America, where the doctrine of the true Sabbath has been most widely preached. Here the temperance work, one of the most prominent and important of moral reforms, is often combined with the Sunday movement, and the advocates of the latter represent themselves as labouring to promote the highest interests of society. And those who refuse to unite with them are denounced as the enemies of temperance and reform. Now, very obviously, of course, the claim that the desecration of Sunday is the cause of all these troubles only further deepens the departure from God's law and entrenches men more firmly in rebellion against the Ten Commandments. Now, this in turn can only open the door to more infidelity, to more spiritualism, and to more iniquity and trouble in the world. And so man's problems become successively worse in consequence of man trying to solve those problems man's own way. In other words, man's solution to the problem only increases the problem. Is that characteristic? It certainly is. It's a principle that man's attempt to solve the problem inevitably worsens the problem. So these people say, well, we must throw out the law and the Sabbath together, and then when iniquity abounds, they say we must throw out it even more so by bringing in Sunday in its place, and that solution only worsens their difficulties. And we find then as a result on page 588 that spiritualism now comes to gain tremendous strength in the world and in the churches. As spiritualism gains in power, then on page 589, through spiritualism, Satan appears as a benefactor of the race, healing the diseases of the people and professing to present a new and more exalted system of religious faith. But at the same time, he works as a destroyer. His temptations are leading multitudes to ruin, intemperance dethrones reason, sensual indulgence, strife and bloodshed follow. Satan delights in war, for it excites the worst passions of the soul and then sweeps into eternity its victims steeped in vice and blood. It is his object to incite the nations to war against one another, for he can thus divert the minds of the people from the work of preparation to stand in the day of God. Now, not only does Satan develop problems so far as international strife is concerned, and there's too much of that going on today for certain. We have this difficulty between Israel and Lebanon and Syria, for starters. We have Colonel Gaddafi's war in Chad and Central Africa, which is now being resisted by the presence of French forces. We have the trouble between South Africa and Zaire, down in the southwest of Africa. There is the war in Central America, and so it goes on and on and on. And Satan delights in these wars because they increase the human problem, increase human suffering, and destroy folk before they have the opportunity of grasping the principles of salvation. But Satan works not only through war, he also works through the elements. And that means, of course, the great forces of nature, as I shall now read on page 589. Satan works through the elements also to garner his harvest of unprepared souls. He has studied the secrets of the laboratories of nature, and he uses all his power to control the elements as far as God allows. When he was suffered to afflict Job, how quickly flocks and herds, servants, houses, children were swept away. One trouble succeeding another as in a moment. It is God who shields his creatures and hedges them in from the power of the destroyer. But the Christian world have shown contempt for the law of Jehovah, and the Lord will do just what he has declared he would. He will withdraw his blessings from the earth and remove his protecting care from those who are rebelling against his law and teaching and forcing others to do the same. Satan has control of all whom God does not especially guard. He will favour and prosper some in order to further his own designs, and he will bring trouble upon others and lead men to believe that it is God who is afflicting them. While appearing to the children of men as a great physician who can heal all their maladies, he will bring disease and disaster until populous cities are reduced to ruin and desolation. Even now he is at work in accidents and calamities by sea and by land, in great conflagrations, in fierce tornadoes and terrific hailstorms, in tempests, floods, cyclones, tidal waves and earthquakes. In every place in 1,000 forms Satan is exercising his power. He sweeps away the ripening harvest, and famine and distress follow. He imparts to the air a deadly taint, and thousands perish by the pestilence. These visitations are to become more and more frequent and disastrous. Destruction will be upon both man and beast. The earth mourneth and fadeth away. The haughty people do languish. The earth also is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, because they have transgressed the laws, changed the ordinance, and broken the everlasting covenant. Now, Sister Wright says that these visitations are to become more and more frequent and more disastrous. We live today many, many years after this book has been written, after this prophecy has been made. And would you not agree that those words are absolutely true? And if you were asked right now to name the year in your whole lifetime which is the worst so far, what year would you name? 1983. So would I. In fact, I've been quite impressed or quite struck with the frequency and the magnitude of disasters we have experienced this particular year. They seem to outnumber and outclass those which we've known in the past. Although there have been some single disasters in the past which are greater than the present ones. For instance, when Hurricane Frederick went through Mobile, Alabama, about 3 or 4 years ago, there was quite a number of billions of dollars worth of damage done, and that was probably one of the record hurricanes of all time. The one passing through Galveston this year was nowhere near as serious as that one, although it did a lot of damage too. But I remember earlier in the year listening to a news broadcast one night after we'd had supper, and in this one news broadcast there were 5 disasters scattered throughout the length and breadth of the earth. I remember them all now. One was a fearful drought in Australia. One was a volcanic eruption, I've forgotten where it was now. Another was an earthquake. Another one was a pile-up on the freeway in France. And the 5th one was floods that swept down to the Mississippi Valley. No, I think it was out in Virginia at that time. You may remember that earlier in the year. And I thought, well, that's quite a spate of disasters for one news broadcast. And next night there were a couple of extra ones. And so it went on and on and on and on. And in last week's Time magazine, I read about the weather conditions here in America. Asked Chuck Wilson, for instance, what it's like this year. So far as farming is concerned, he'll give you a dismal report.
In Las Vegas, they had
a flood. A flood? Incredible. And the Time magazine said that where farmers are just begging for relief from flooding, the thunderstorms are pouring more rain down, and not very far away where they're drought-stricken, the sky is clear and blue. And so we're living in a time when these disasters and troubles are becoming more and more frequent. Along with them, there is terrorism, there are economic woes, there are troubles of every possible nature and description developing in the world at the present time. Now, what Satan is doing then is developing in the world today a problem situation of enormous magnitude, greater than what men have ever known in the past. Now, what do problems require? Right? They require solutions. This is what they require, are solutions. And Satan knows perfectly well that when conditions in this world produce problems which threaten man's very existence, and that's what these problems are doing more and more as time goes by, that man will naturally look to himself as the problem solver. But, and first of all, of course, the responsibility for solving the problems of the nation are vested in the political parties in the various countries around the world. And of course, there's nothing more divided than politics. I'm sure we all know that particular fact. Nothing more divided than politics, and a house divided against itself, of course, is weak. And Satan, of course, desires to bring the entire world under one head, a unified, confederated world in combined rebellion against the God of heaven and in full and complete support of him and his policies. Now, today, of course, the various political parties are attempting to bring solution to these pressing problems. One party goes into power and it strives to solve these problems, but the result is, of course, that they just don't do what they promised to do. So the people then say, well, let's give another party a try, and they put in the opposition, and they don't do as well, usually, or maybe just as well or just as bad. You can't say do well, they do badly. And I feel that there is developing in the world today an increasing sense of disappointment in and distrust of political parties. Down in Australia, for instance, the parties destroy themselves by fighting within themselves. They can't even be united inside their own ranks. And this, of course, disgusts the people and causes them to lose confidence in these various political parties. So this then, of course, paves the way for the rising of another problem solver who so far has been very, very much in the background, though, of course, less and less in the background as time goes by. And this, of course, is the papacy. We understand from Revelation chapter 13 that all the world is going to wander after the beast, the entire world. And they'll ask questions such as, who can go to war against him? who can do anything else but serve him and follow him. Now, progressively, the churches in the world are coming into unity. They are uniting. And when the Pope and the churches combine, they'll have an extremely powerful argument in their favour over the political parties, because they will say politics are divided, they fight amongst themselves and between themselves, but here we find at last the churches have put away all their differences, and while the political parties are going from bad to worse, the church goes from good to better. Now the world, wearied of those institutions, congresses, parliaments, whatever you might like to call them, which have been a failure for so long, will see in this mighty confederation of the churches under one new head the prospect of the total solution to all their problems. And of course, naturally, this vast and wonderful organisation is going to promise a total solution to all their problems. Now, this will be a repeating of the story of King Ahab and Naboth the Jezreelite. Let's go back to 1 Kings chapter 23. I think it's 23. And just briefly review that story, because it does have a very definite bearing on the experience of God's people down in these last days. 1 Kings 21, my mistake. Chapter 21 in 1 Kings. 23 is the story of the... there is no 23. Yes, there is. 23 is... no, 22 is the last chapter of 1 Kings. Now, we know the story of Naboth fairly well, I should imagine. I think we have covered it at least once in our past study of the of these various principles. And there was Naboth the Jezreelite, who owned this vineyard, which was very, very close to the palace of Ahab. And Ahab wanted that vineyard very, very much. And in a very gentlemanly way, he said to Naboth in verse 2, "Give me thy vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs, because it is near to my house, and I will give thee for a better vineyard than it, or, if it seem good to thee, I will give thee the worth of it in money." Now, one can hardly criticise Ahab's approach to Naboth. It was courteous, it was polite, it was fair. He was prepared to offer good money for the vineyard, or to replace it with a better one somewhere else. It was the location which was important to him, and he was quite prepared to pay well for it, and that sounds a very reasonable proposition. But there's a problem. And verse 3, Naboth said to Ahab, "The Lord forbiddeth me that I should give the inheritance of my fathers unto thee." Now Naboth revealed himself here as a law keeper, an obedient servant of God, who would not betray the principles laid down in the Mosaic law. But how much did Ahab care for the law of God? Nothing whatsoever. Not the slightest care about the law of God. And when Ahab found that the law of God stood in his way, so he could not have what he wanted while that law existed, he went to his house very heavy and displeased, because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him. Now, when Jezebel, his wife, came to him and said to him in verse 5, "Why is thy spirit so sad that thou eatest no bread?" In other words, she said to him, "What is your problem? Obviously, you've got a problem. What is it?" And he told her what the problem was. And then Jezebel said in verse 7, "Dost thou now govern the kingdom of Israel? Arise and eat bread and let thine heart be merry. I will give thee the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite." But by whose power? The king's power. In other words, she took the king's power in order to solve the king's problem. Now, this story is a typical one in that it's a type of events in the last days. We turn to Revelation, the 2nd chapter, remembering the message to the Thyatiran church, which we spent time studying last year. Revelation 2 and verse 20, "Notwithstanding I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest a woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants, to commit fornication, and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. So Revelation definitely treats Jezebel as a type. And she appeared again in the Middle Ages during the Thyatiran period, not of course the original Jezebel, but the antitypical one. And if the Babylonian system of the Middle Ages was the antitype of Jezebel of the Old Testament period, then what shall we call then the final manifestation of Babylon the Great but that woman Jezebel all over again? Now Jezebel is the name of that woman in Revelation chapter 17 who rides upon the scarlet-coloured beast. Now true, her name is called there Babylon the Great, but is not Jezebel Babylon the Great? They're both the same. And so the time is soon coming when the stage will be set. Everything's moving into line, even at this present time, for the churches to come to the rescue. In fact, when I was studying English at the New Zealand University, quite a number of years ago now, there was a Roman Catholic nun in my class. And it was a history class in which we were studying, and one day several of the students got into a conversation. I was just listening in, and they were talking about the present world troubles and where we were going, and the Roman Catholic nun simply said with a very sweet smile on her face, "Don't worry, gentlemen," she says. "The church saved the world in the past, it'll do it again." And that was a firm conviction. And today the Roman Catholic Church is only waiting her day of opportunity. And she'll rise up and say, "We saved the world in the past, we'll do it again." And I'll say to the state, "Give us your power and we will solve your problems. Give us your power and we will solve your problems." Now, of course, the powers of the world, all the political parties and all the people of the world that give their support to those parties will be so blind and so dumb that they won't see the foolishness of this argument. Because the only kind of power that the church can ever justifiably operate by is the power of God and not the power of the state. Now, if the power of the state was not able under the state's direction to solve all these problems, if the problems of mankind prove to be greater than man's power and greater than the power of the state, then how can the church possibly do better with that power than the state does with that power? And the answer is they obviously cannot. In fact, it will be shown that they'll do vastly worse with that power than the state did with the same power. Because when the church takes over the power of the state and uses it to solve man's problems or try and solve man's problems, then the time of trouble will really get to be a time of trouble. And very shortly will come the 7 last plagues and the fearful destructive forces which will almost completely obliterate mankind. Now, what we must see at this point of time and see with great clarity is that there's going to be this vast worldwide attempt by man to build God's kingdom man's way. Up until that point of time, scattered efforts have been made to do that. Not always so scattered, by the way, because in Nebuchadnezzar's day, again, of course, in the times of the papacy, the effort wasn't so scattered. There was a central figure, Nebuchadnezzar in the first instance and the Pope of Rome in the second instance, and these mighty potentates with the power of the world's armies at their command did seek to solve humanity's problems, but of course they only made them worse and suffered destruction themselves. After all said and done, if the church couldn't save herself from destruction in the past, how can she save the world from destruction in the future? That's quite impossible. It's like the small boy said to the Roman Catholic priest who couldn't find the post office one day and tried to show the boy the way to heaven the next. He said, you couldn't even find the post office yesterday, how can you show me to heaven today? Which was quite a pertinent question to ask of that cleric. And so when the church then could not save herself from decline and decay and destruction by 1798, if she couldn't do that for herself, then how can she save the world from destruction in 1900 and whatever it might happen to be in the future when this time comes? But please, let's try and recognise the fact that what is building up in the world today is the most gigantic, the most sophisticated, the most ambitious, the most hopeful, the most determined effort upon man's part ever to build God's kingdom man's way. It will be the same sin which marked Israel at Kadesh Barnea, the same thing which destroyed the Jews when they rejected Jesus Christ and caused them to reject Jesus Christ. It's the same thing which built the papacy and the Christian church. It's the same thing which built the great apostasy in the Dark Ages. It's the same thing which brought about the fall of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and the same thing which endangers our existence too, right? Because while so far we love the Sabbath rest principles and dedicate ourselves to live by them day by day, and fortunately we understand these things more clearly than churches in the past have ever done, the fact is if we don't safeguard that way of life, we shall fall as all the other churches have done before us. Now then, when this vast confederacy, this ultimate effort upon man's part to solve his own problems his own way arises from the ruin of the present times, we as God's folk, because we understand the Sabbath rest principle, will recognise the exact nature of this apparently promising venture. And in the mighty power of God's Spirit we shall rise and preach the most searching analyses of the actual nature of this wicked thing. And when you consider, of course, the mighty arguments we already have, plus the even better arguments we'll have then, because every day I find in my own mind the Sabbath rest message grows brighter and clearer and more powerful. And in fact, this camp meeting is simply a continuation of that subject, isn't it? Right? A continuation of it, down to new and more powerful depths. So when we find then that God's people understand these Sabbath rest principles, recognise the exact nature of this vast confederacy of evil, and expose the very heart of this wicked system, then you'll recognise the true nature of the issue over the Sabbath and Sunday in the last days. It'll not for one moment be a contest over which day of the week is the right day. That's already settled. That's no argument. All the churches know which day is the true Sabbath day, don't they? They all know that. And therefore that's not going to be the issue. The issue is going to be one way of building God's kingdom versus the other way of building God's kingdom. Now, when we in the mighty power of the Spirit expose the very heart of that wicked system and therefore threaten its very existence, then how shall we be regarded by the world, as benefactors or enemies? As enemies. Exactly as Esau misjudged Jacob, so the world is going to misjudge us. That is the prospect which lies before us. And our present knowledge of the Sabbath rest principles will help us to understand Jacob's trouble far better than we've done in the past, and will in turn prepare us for that battle when it comes. Now right there I must leave it because our time is gone. Our fixed time periods are 45 minutes. But be sure and come back in the morning because the next part of the study is very, very interesting and very revealing and very valuable to us all.